Welcome everyone to week 4, where we talk about self-esteem and self-affirmation. We're connecting to the topic of trying to use certain needs that people have in order to help them maybe overcome their problems or achieve greater things. And one of that, or two approaches to that are super popular. They used to be super popular, or still are to some extent, within social psychology, within psychology, but they're especially popular outside of psychology. There's a firm belief that self-esteem and self-affirmation are basically the cure to all evils. And we will look at that critically, which speaks in favor of these ideas, why people think so, why are there so many people who are strongly convinced this is true, and also maybe some problematic accounts of that and why this might sometimes even backfire, and why it might be a bad idea at times to try to increase the self-esteem of another person. So if you kind of look on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, etc., whatever your social media of choice, then what you can see is that there's a lot that it has something along those lines, where somebody is telling you you're doing amazing. I think a lot of these people post things along those lines. You're special, you're amazing, believe in yourself, you are great, and all of these things in order to boost our self-esteem. And I think a lot of these accounts, when you read about them and their motivations, are kind of genuinely concerned about trying to increase maybe the success and the happiness and well-being of their followers. And they're very popular, right? I think this post was taken from one account. There's more than 1 million subscribers or followers on Instagram. So this is here an article from Elle, the fashion magazine. The social media is going through, is actually from this year, from 2021. Is going through a change. The gram seems to be evolving, whether it's Bella Hadid sharing a slideshow of 5 things you should hear today, or Precious Lee captioning a photo, Affirmation Tuesday. I am abundant. Self-affirming language and content have become a welcomed addition to the social media space. I would argue that this has been always somewhat there. I think a lot of these accounts, when you look at them, have been around, and they're around also because they're so popular. People hear us, they say, oh, this is really welcome. It's not just pictures of what I just have, my coffee or my breakfast or what I'm wearing today, but no, reaffirming, self-affirming messages, really welcome. And so one thing we want to look at, are they actually that welcome? Should we be happy to see these in our streams, in our feeds, or should we be cautious about them? Do they do good, or do they maybe no good at all, or maybe they even harm us and the people who follow them? What can we as psychologists say about these things? And we will address this in our session, in our live session, but start to think about this today in this video. This is an Instagram account called Affirmations. We talk about affirmations in the second part of our lecture this week. But this is the idea basically that there's you reaffirm some self-affirmations, you reaffirm some important aspect of yourself. We will look a little bit at the differences between how popular accounts think about self-affirmation, how psychologists think about self-affirmation, but we will dive into that under the topic of when the self is under threat. When we are threatened, we often fear, or like psychologists for a long time believe that self-affirmation can actually be a really helpful source. How we should do it, how should we think about it, and so forth is the topic of our second part of this week's lecture. All right, so let's start with kind of connecting a little bit with the psychology we talked about in the last week. And here there's this really strong idea of the need to self-integrity. Right? We talked about last week when we talked about wise interventions that we can take advantage of that people really strongly want to feel that they're good people, that they're decent people, that we do things well, and that others like us. Maybe we want to think about that we are attractive and really social, and we're good at things that we cherish. And so there's this need to self-integrity, which might also help us to a little bit understand why a lot of the self-affirmation stuff is, or self-esteem and self-affirmation is so popular. But what if you the idea behind the self-esteem movement, which we talk about in a second, is this kind of like, what if we circuit that, if we shortcut that, if we just say, okay, instead of actually trying to use this sense to help them to make a meaningful transition in their life, what if we directly boost self-esteem? So many want to have high self-esteem. Why don't we just directly boost self-esteem? And so there's a self-esteem movement, and we come to that in a second. But the idea here, and I think it's really widespread, is that self-esteem has profound consequences for every aspect of our existence, says Nathaniel Branden, who's like the founder of the Self movement, or kind of one of the founders of the self-esteem movement. I cannot think of a single psychological problem, from anxiety to depression to fear of intimacy or of success to spouse battery or child molestation, that is not traceable to the problem of low self-esteem. So here it is the idea, it is a really powerful idea, that everything that ails us as a society can basically trace back to a person having low self-esteem. It is the person it's the man who beats their wife because they have low self-esteem, and they need to do that to make them feel better about themselves. There's a person who has a very low self-esteem and hence is afraid of intimacy because they feel like they might be found out by intimacy, and so forth. You can make a convincing case for each of them why this might be true. The second bit we look at is like, okay, so there's one thing feeling about good, and the other bit is when the self comes under threat. When we are threatened by content of some, for instance, and this will be the focus of the second part, if somebody stereotypes us, if they think like, oh, look, Andreas, he is a German, oh, I wonder if he's racist. And now I'm thinking like I'm under this double kind of looking glass. People are staring, like maybe I feel like, oh, everybody's observing exactly what I'm saying. Now I become very defensive about it, and this might be really harming to my performance, for instance, to my teaching, but other performances as well. And so this is like what we think about the self-threat. When some valuable, important aspect of self is threatened, the idea is that some kind of defensive mechanisms become activated and thereby hamper our performance. And what we can do about it, that is, will self-affirmation help to improve that, is the topic of the second bit of our module this week. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the self-esteem movement. So I think it's basically impossible to avoid or kind of have an idea of what the self-esteem movement is. I think it's very closely related to things we talked about last week. We talked about think positive, believe in yourself, and so forth. And the idea here basically is that we should try to make everyone feel good about themselves. They should feel that they're a fantastic person with great qualities, and that they are attractive and intelligent and so forth. And that will give them a really good evaluation of themselves. So self-esteem, if you kind of look at what does it mean, right? It's basically saying, just as the word suggests, it's like psychologists think of it, how high is your esteem for your own person, for your own self? How much a person values themselves? It's like an evaluation. If I look at myself in summary and then say, oh, do I have a feeling that I'm on average like a good person, a not so good person, or a person of low esteem? So this idea became really, really popular. I think if you look at the research that's done in social psychology in particular, but also in psychology in general, within the 80s and 90s, self-esteem was everywhere. People thought like, oh man, this is the thing. We finally got it. This is our contribution that psychology can do to fix the problems of the world. And so in California, that was especially prevalent, this idea. And they had this basically, the state governor, they started to fund the task force each year to improve the self-esteem of the people living within. And the idea behind it is like, if we can trace all of these problems of that we have, like crime and drug abuse and teen pregnancy and school unachievement, if this is all part of like the problem is low self-esteem, why don't we invest massively into high self-esteem interventions that by boosting basically the performance of our of the citizens that live within our state, and hence everybody would be happier, less crime, and we would even have more taxes because people who have high self-esteem, or so it seem to also earn more money. So there was basically the statewide movement to put onto the curriculum, and wherever you go, into prisons, into the workforce, interventions that should boost self-esteem. So there was a really like a outsized, a massive promise that self-esteem was basically the root of all evil, and if you kind of eradicate that evil, everything else will fall into place. So why is this idea of self-esteem so appealing? I think there's one thing where we kind of look at it, it's like, oh, if I look at successful people, if I look at people who are happy, if I look at people who maybe you and I admire, we think like, oh, there's high self-esteem people, right? There are people who really are self-assured, who think well of themselves, and maybe that is their source, right? If I want to have a scientist and a business person and maybe a great team player, if I look at all of them and think about, okay, what do they have in common? I think one thing that seems to appeal to all of us is that all of them have self-esteem. If only I would think more highly of myself, you might think, then I wouldn't have problems tackling difficult problems or planning my way to get into the Forbes billionaires list, okay? So I think there's an intuitive appeal to that. And if you kind of look at what people have in common who are successful, maybe that's it. They're just really confident. They know who they are, they like themselves, and so they never give up when they face any difficulties. So, and there's also, as I mentioned, our own, we feel like, oh, and I would like to have a high self-esteem. Maybe I need a higher self-esteem. Feels good to do and think about it, and it also feels good to do things about it. So there's a kind of a well-being, anticipated well-being boost from just talking and thinking about boosting our self-esteem. Okay. The key question, and we come back to that in more detail, especially when we talk about the interventions, but one of the key questions is, right, is high self-esteem a cause or a consequence of success? And so the team that says here, is let me read out that quote, it says, diminished self-esteem stands as a powerful independent variable. So of course, this is an experimental psychologist talking, so it's an independent variable cause in the genesis of major social problems. We all know this to be true. The real problem we must address is how can we determine that it's scientifically true? This is like, oh, we come in, we know it's true. How can we determine that it's scientifically true? I think this is something that you often hear now about when people talk about mindfulness interventions. They say like, we know it's great and we know that this can transform the world, but how can we prove it scientifically that it is true? So this is not just a problem of the past. We have similar ideas coming around again and again in psychology and trying to fix people. But here's the idea that if I increase your self-esteem, then what will follow is that your academic performance will flourish, that you might meet more people, that you will be more outgoing, more proactive, and when things go wrong, you will tackle these problems with greater persistence and tenacity. The other viewpoint, which also seems to be intuitively kind of makes sense, is to say like, well, if good things happen to me, if I work hard and then I achieve something, that boosts my self-esteem. So here it's just a consequence. So it's not the cause of my success. So my cause might be my hard work, the things I put in, the preparations, the strategies I use, and so forth. And it's not so much it's not so much whether I think I'm an awesome person or not. No, here the high self-esteem is the consequence of having success. And so here in particular, it's like, why do all successful people have high self-esteem? Because they have success that led them to have high self-esteem. So both of these kind of make sense, and now we have to sort a little bit the evidence and see like what is true, what makes sense scientifically. Just a word on measurement, and I think that's a really, really key thing in self-esteem. So this is the most popular scale to measure self-esteem, the Rosenberg, I think it's general sense of self-esteem scale. There's a short version of that just says, I have high self-esteem. There's just one single item, and it has a very good reliability and also correlates very well with the larger scale. The larger scale has 10 items, and they ask you questions like, okay, on the whole, I'm satisfied with myself. I feel that I have a number of good qualities. I feel that I'm a person of worth, at least on an equal plane with others. Or here, a reverse coded item. I wish I could have more respect for myself. Okay, so obviously self-esteem is something that is about how do you think about yourself. I don't have an objective measure for that. I don't think there ever will be an objective measure for that. So we have to rely on self-reports. And so the idea of the self-esteem movement is basically that people who have high self-esteem, they kind of look at their good qualities or maybe focus on them and kind of see, okay, this is a valuable way of reflecting on who the person is. So if I'm passionate and if I'm motivated and trustworthy and so forth, I look at these qualities and say like, yes, if I look at who I am and what I do and compare myself to others, then I see that I am on average a really good person. Or not, right? But this would be an idea of kind of like of measuring self-esteem, where people are able to make these somewhat objectively comparisons within themselves to the qualities or standards they want to live up to and to others. So there's this kind of, let's call it like a positive aspect of self-esteem, where high self-esteem would reflect actually that a person has a lot of good qualities, that they're honest, that they're funny, that they're socially skilled, that they're confident, etc. Okay, so whatever qualities you cherish. But there's also a different side, right? You can easily think about some higher self-esteem people and think a little bit, not sure if I want to be like them. They're a little bit appalling. And what is that? Is that there are these kind of, trifecta things that also are associated with high self-esteem. So a person that has high self-esteem could either kind of reflect honestly about their own qualities and then come to a positive evaluation, or it could be defensive mechanisms, right? So Paulus has this idea that we basically deceive others or the self. Paulus focused on self-deception. So like maybe we think we're really good because we can't really live with the truth that we are not as good, especially for instance when we compare ourselves to others. So it's good to kind of think of myself as a good person. That might be helpful to deceive myself, but also to deceive others. Okay, so there's a defensive mechanism that prevents me from actually knowing myself. Okay, there's another really interesting aspect about temporal stability. So it seems like that people who have high self-esteem, some of them have a really high self-esteem, is very stable. And stable high self-esteem is associated with, kind of, for instance, less aggression, right? But there's also an unstable, kind of almost fragile sense of high self-esteem. And so that is not very robust over time. And so this, for instance, so you could have a person who has high self-esteem and is stable. They often have very low levels of aggression, but people with high self-esteem and an unstable sense, like an unstable high self-esteem, this is often associated with, there's my son coming in, this is often associated with negative outcomes, okay? And then we have narcissistic tendencies. We might just have really grandiose ideas about ourselves, kind of fantasies we live in, and this is reflected, right? So narcissists always have high self-esteem. High self-esteem doesn't always lead to narcissism, right? But this is kind of like this idea, there's this other bit of the self-esteem out there that is somewhat narcissistic, defensive, and unstable, and that is more associated with negative outcomes. Here it's like you can basically look at these twins, right? And it's like one of them has high self-esteem that is reflected of a good, and one that has high self-esteem that might be reflective of these defensive, unstable, narcissistic views. It's impossible to tell from the measurement what is what, right? Just as I probably couldn't tell the twins apart. So you can't really tell often in research apart what aspect of high self-esteem are we talking about. So let's kind of think about it. High self-esteem, come back to that. We know now, okay, there's a little bit of a problem that people with high self-esteem might be actually think of themselves as really good people because they reflect somehow their past and their behavior. And there's this other kind of evil twin that might be more defensive, unstable, and narcissistic. Okay, and it's important to keep in mind when we are trying to figure out, is high self-esteem a cause or a consequence of success? One kind of a little bit dampener to this idea, if you only can raise high self-esteem, everything will be wonderful. If you kind of measure, especially in the US, self-esteem, but also in the UK, we have very similar data here. What you can see is that people actually think very highly of themselves in general. There's not it's not this kind of like epidemic of people who have low self-esteem. No, most people think it quite highly, at least when they are answering questions from psychologists of themselves. So you can see it's also on the rise. There's like Jean Twenge has, and Keith Campbell, but Twenge in particular, she really made the case that there's like, oh look, our children become more and more narcissistic. I'm a little bit skeptical. The evidence seems to be a little bit more conflicting. It might also be just like old people complaining about younger people, but there's the generation me idea, right? That it's basically, this is on the rise. So it doesn't seem like that these that if we just raise self-esteem that we can fix all our problem, because most people seem to have already pretty high self-esteem. So that kind of dampens maybe a little bit like how much we can actually achieve by increasing self-esteem. But nevertheless, one kind of, let's say, like, if we want to ask ourselves, is self-esteem actually associated with good academic performance, with being attractive, with being intelligent, and so forth? It sounds like that, okay, if you see these people here, let's say these are the evil twins, the kind of self-esteem, the defensive, unstable, narcissistic ones. If I ask them, hey, rate yourself how attractive you are, rate yourself how intelligent you are, rate yourself how well you do in school, you probably get a lot of inflated measurements, because people who are narcissistic might have a really biased view of themselves and their performance. So it's quite tricky, and we have to look at kind of trying to disentangle a little bit objective from subjective rating. So here's, does attractive people have higher self-esteem? There's like this one study which is crazy, sometimes it's lower, but it's like harder. In 1993 they find it's like 0.85. It's like, is the correlation between attractiveness, self-rated attractiveness. If you would ask me, Andreas, how attractive you are, and I basically say 1, and then I should like, how high is your self-esteem? I would basically also say a 1. It's like, I think I'm not very attractive, hence I don't have very high self-esteem. So it seems like that, okay, from this study alone, if there would be actually a real correlation, it seems like that we can kind of say, okay, self-esteem is maybe solely based on attractiveness. Okay, but there's this problem that maybe narcissistic, defensive, unstable, self-esteem people just think that they're really attractive. If you then look at kind of, and take a picture of me, right? In my case, it would probably still be a 1, but let's say they take a picture of these low and high self-esteem people and let others rate their attractiveness, okay? Then you can see the correlation completely disappears. There's no correlation between being attractive and having high or low self-esteem, okay? So it seems like people who think that they are, or people with high self-esteem think of themselves very highly indeed, and so they have kind of biased understanding of their own attractiveness. There's similar ways with looking at this. In the same study, they also looked at intelligence, and you can see like the bigger, basically, the higher my self-esteem, the bigger the difference between what I think how intelligent I am and how intelligent I actually am. So there's no real correlation between these two. Academic performance, and this I think is the last slide for the video today, it's very, very similar. So there's a weak correlation between self-esteem and academic performance. And I think about academic performance that it gives us objective measure, right? I can just see what are your marks are. So there's a weak correlation between self-esteem and academic performance. So it's between 0.1 and 0.3. Often it's more 0.15 or so. So there's a little bit of that, okay? And the correlations might be caused by underlying third factors. Most people think now that if you find a relationship between self-esteem and academic performance, it might actually indicate that there's a third variable operating, right? So it is basically that, for instance, people who might have earlier achievements might feel better about themselves. So if they ask, what do you think, are you a good person? You said yes, and you kind of reflect on your recent achievements, and that then also leads you to have higher achievements thereafter, but it's not so much the self-esteem, it's just that this was reflected of your past performance. The same is like with socioeconomic status and class. You might have more resources to perform better, and these resources also inflate your perception of yourself and how good you are as a person. So that might also explain the relationship between self-esteem and academic performance. Most people now think that self-esteem might be a consequence, not a cause of the grades. But this is somewhat debated because it's like, okay, what we need basically to do is we need to do intervention studies. We need to change or try to change your self-esteem, addressing only your self-esteem, and then see, does that actually boost your academic performance? Does that? So while the correlational studies indicate that maybe self-esteem or high self-esteem might be a consequence and not a cause for academic performance, a good academic performance, we need to do interventions to do so. And this is what we will start our lecture on Wednesday with. All right, see you then.